the Bloom's taxonomy. So this is something that might be new and might be a little unfamiliar to some of us, but to some of us, we might already know what Bloom's taxonomy is. And you might be wondering what Bloom's digital taxonomy is and why am I talking about this strange thing which sounds very confusing and convoluted when we were to be talking about tech tools. Is this a new tech tool? No. Bloom's taxonomy is one of the oldest and the most highly regarded frameworks within the education space, which talks about how educators set out learning objectives for their students. And this actually, in very, very simple terms, helps us classify the different learning objectives that we set aside for our students, that we create for our students. And it helps classify these in order of complexity. So lower order learning skills, moving up to higher order learning skills. And we'll talk about this in a little more detail. So there's no, for those of us who are hearing about Bloom's taxonomy for the first time, don't worry, we will be elaborating in much, much more detail about what Bloom's taxonomy is and how this classification of learning objectives works. But before I do that, I'd also like to identify why I'm talking about Bloom's taxonomy and how it's connected to choosing tech tools. So the most important part or the most important step in choosing your tech tools is actually designing your learning objectives first, and then choosing which tech tool helps you to achieve that learning objective. And that is exactly where Bloom's taxonomy comes in, because Bloom's taxonomy allows us to create these learning objectives and classify them into different skill sets that we'd like the students to be able to build. So now I'm going to talk more about Bloom's taxonomy, after which I will talk about Bloom's digital taxonomy, which is about using Bloom's taxonomy within the digital space, which is where our tech tools come in. So first and foremost, breaking down the Bloom's taxonomy, we'll watch a little video on that as well, which will help you understand this better with a little example. So what exactly is Bloom's taxonomy? As you can see on the screen, this is the classification that Bloom's taxonomy, or taxonomy is essentially just a fancy word for structure. So Bloom's taxonomy structures students' learning skills into these different bands, so to speak, moving from lower order thinking skills upwards to higher order thinking skills. So when we start out with building our students' skills, we start out with some of the lower order skills like remembering, moving on to then making them understand something, then getting them to apply something and analyze the content or the concept, after which they would evaluate it, which is where they would justify their stands or provide explanations for their choices. And then they'd be able to create something new using all of this new skill, all of these new skills and all of this new knowledge that they've been able to acquire. So the taxonomy is just a structuring of how students are able to acquire knowledge and how they move up from lower order thinking skills to higher order thinking skills. Bloom's taxonomy does talk about other skills like social skills and affective skills, but for today's session, we are primarily going to be focusing on thinking skills. We will be doing another session on affective skills and social and emotional learning, so stay tuned for that. But for today's session, we will be talking mostly about cognitive and thinking skills, and we'll talk about how you can design learning objectives for each of these different skill sets that you'd like to develop in your students.